Hello and welcome. First, a huge thanks to Books and Books in Miami for hosting this event today on Crowdcast. Thank you greatly, visionary owner of Books and Books, Mitchell Kaplan, and to Christina Nosti for all you do to make these events happen, and to Sophie Perez, your colleague, and to the whole great staff at Books and Books, one of the great independent bookstores in the nation. And we'll say more about that before we're done today. Thank you out there for being with us. I'm Peter Balakian, a founding member and steering committee member of Writers for Democratic Action. I'm a poet, a nonfiction writer, an essayist, and I teach at Colgate University. I'd like to say something about Writers for Democratic Action first. It's a great honor for me to work with my fellow WDA writers. WDA is an organization of writers worldwide with a membership now of over 3,000. And I urge all of you out there, if you're so inclined, and if you're a writer in any shape or form, to go to our website and join. We're a volunteer organization devoted to working for democracy, and especially in the US now, when our democracy is under attack in the wake of political violence, an attempted coup d'etat by a former president, virulent conspiracy theory campaigns, assaults on the rights of women, people of color, the LGBTQ community. We at WDA believe in literature as a bedrock of democratic culture, and literary language as a force of humanistic inquiry and cultural cohesion. Writers for Democratic Action has generated getting out the vote campaigns during the fall of 20 and 22. We are now focused on fighting the new wave of book banning as we witness it in places like Florida and Texas. We work at connecting citizens to their bookstores and libraries, and we host educational webinars each month that focus on national and international issues as they pertain to democracy here and around the world. Some of our recent webinars have included conversations with Congressman Jamie Raskin, writer Margaret Atwood, poets from the Ukraine, scholars from Turkey. And today, it's a great pleasure to welcome poet and memoirist Javier Zamora. Javier Zamora was born in La Herradura, El Salvador in 1990. His first poetry collection, Unaccompanied, explored some of this history, and now his New York Times best-selling memoir, Solito, is an account of his 9-week journey from El Salvador to Guatemala to Mexico through the Sonoran Desert to the US. One more note about some of Javier's career. He's held MFA residencies, postdoctorate, I should say, post-MFA residencies at Stanford University and Colgate University, fellowships from McDowell, Yaddo, Macondo, the NEA, the Poetry Foundation, the Lannan Foundation. He's won awards from Narrative Magazine and also from Barnes & Noble for his work on the Undocu Poets campaign. And today he comes to us from his home in Tucson. A few notes about Solito. Javier's memoir brings us an important voice. As a literary work, he tells the story of his immigration journey from El Salvador as a 9-year-old alone with a group, some of whom become like surrogate family to him. His parents have left El Salvador because of the US-funded civil war of the 1980s. Javier can't remember his father, and his mother left when he was 5, and he's grown up in a warm, loving family with his grandparents and aunt. He tells the story through a first-person persona, taking us into the mind of a child in the throes of an arduous and terrifying passage from one world to another with no guarantee of survival. Javier writes with a poet's sense of the image, of the granular, of the sensory world and its impact on the body in duress. He brings us into a profound human struggle. His memoir contributes to literary culture and to political culture. The US has been infected by Donald Trump's dehumanizing political, policy, and rhetorical assaults. I apologize for that. Political assaults on immigrants and on the very meaning of migration. And Javier's memoir offers us a deeply humanizing vision of what it means to have the courage and strength to migrate. A vision of real people in real time in conditions of extremity. I want to believe that anyone who once believed in the Trumpian view of immigrants, especially from the global South, would have to alter their perceptions after reading Javier's memoir. Migration is part of human history. There has never been a time when humans haven't migrated. That is why no matter where we live, we can trace the origins of the human species to East Africa. Migration is an essential part of civilization. And if you're not Native American, you or your ancestors have migrated to the US. And the US does have more foreign-born citizens than any country in the world, about 14% of its population. At this moment, the number of refugees on the planet is the highest since World War II. 54 civil wars going on around the world, the Russian-Ukraine war, gang violence in various parts of the world, and severe climate change crisis are the causes. 1 in 74 of the global population are fleeing crisis. The vast majority have fled to poor and lower income countries. Clearly, wealthy countries need to do more. Now I'm going to turn it over to Javier Zamora, and he's going to read from the beginning of a short passage from the beginning of chapter 3, if you have his book. And if you don't have his book, let me remind you, you can buy it from Books and Books in Miami, and you can get it from independent bookstores nationwide. After Javier's passage, I will ask him a few questions, and then I want to turn it over to you, the audience, and I'll be fielding questions on the Ask a Question button on the Crowdcast. So, Javier, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Books and Books. This is a huge honor, and I would like to remind you, Peter, that you were perhaps the first person to suggest that I write a memoir, so the memoir wouldn't exist without you. And now I'll read a few paragraphs from the beginning of chapter 3. So I leave El Salvador when I'm 9 years old on April 6th of 1999, and the book walks with me until I'm reunited with my parents one June 11th, 1999. But before then, we're in Guatemala, and this chapter 2, at the end of chapter 1, my grandpa and I leave, and he's with me for 2 weeks in Guatemala in a place called Tecunuman, but then he has to return. And then myself and the group of 7 other immigrants, we go to a coastal town named Ocos, Guatemala, on the border of, on the Mexican border. So this is Ocos, Guatemala, April 27th, 1999. We're in Ocos, a small fishing town. In La Herradura, I heard the ocean waves crashing against the rocks only during big storms. The estero water underneath the pier was calm, sweet, and surrounded by mangroves. If I wanted to get to the ocean, it was a 30-minute boat ride through the mangroves. Here, the ocean is walking distance. A few blocks away, the loud roar of the tides, the sand, the breeze, the salt in the air remind me of home. Here, like in Tecunuman, at night I stare at the ceiling, waiting for something to fall on my bed, a cockroach in my mouth, a spider on my eye, a scorpion at my feet. There's no mosquito net hanging on top of my bed like back home. Grandpa isn't here to talk to me before falling asleep, to go out for walks and explore the town. And because of that, I feel alone, lonely, solo, solito, solito de verdad. The adults don't really talk to me besides, good morning, good night, pass the food, wake up. And I'm too shy to talk to them, awkward. So I mostly keep to myself and stay out of their way. When the adults talk, I look at my hands. I hold them together and play with my thumbs. I don't know what to say, who to stay close to. Marcelo pays no attention to me. All he does is smoke and drink. I feel like wet sand, like mud, like the corn dough Abuelita makes pupusas with, her fingers making and breaking clumps. Clap, clap, clap. I'm in a room with Patricia and Carla. Our room is small. We let the fan buzz all night, all day, in order to keep us cool and keep the mosquitoes away. My bed is across from theirs. I can almost touch where Patricia and Carla sleep, next to the window with my arm. Patricia's and Carla's eyebrows get closer together whenever I do anything. I annoy everyone. So I just stay in the room, try to sleep, look at the map, memorize things. I want Grandpa to be here. I watch how Patricia makes sure Carla eats everything on her plate, how she tucks her in at night, kisses her forehead before bed. In the morning, she brushes her daughter's black, wavy hair, braids it or puts it up in a ponytail, lays out her clothes on the bed. Grandpa told me to stay close to Marcelo, but when I try to talk to him, he tells me to leave him alone. He only talks to me when he sends me out to fetch his daily packs of Marlboro. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Javier, let me start with a writing question because there's no substitute for real literariness, and you're a poet. What was the most difficult challenge for you in writing this memoir?
Huh. Was remembering, I talk about a trauma that I tried to address in my first book of poems. And I, for various reasons, one of them being not being in therapy and not having a green card, I couldn't. I felt like I was just at the tip of the iceberg with unaccompanied. And writing this book, I was constantly, to use a metaphor, like a looking over at a precipice that I didn't want to go, under. And every day I was re-traumatized on purpose. But by that point, I had a therapist, I had my now wife, I was doing Reiki, I was doing a lot of things to keep me from having bad episodes. Other words to use would be PTSD. But every day I knew that I had the support and I could just retrace my steps because it's something that I know that I needed to do.
And just a quick follow up: did the manuscript go through many drafts?
Yeah, it's weird because I started writing poetry when I was 17, and I do have poems in unaccompanied that I started writing when I was 17, and that took 10 years. Solito is much longer, and it took me 2.5 years. And I do have to say that for me, the pandemic made it possible to stay at home and not do anything else but write.
Yep.
And because of that, I went through various drafts, um, with first with my wife, and then with my agent, and then finally, once we sold the book, with the editor. So it's been a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just comment briefly that it's a strange phenomenon that I experienced as well. The pandemic, for all of its horror and destruction, afforded some of us who do what we do this amazing space to work. And
Yeah.
this happens to writers and maybe other artists and so forth. Let me ask you this. Let me put this question this way. America America's multi-ethnicity is the result of immigration infusions over a couple hundred years. And the history of immigration in the US has had ups and downs, good periods and xenophobic periods. Clearly, the Trump administration created harsh conditions and destructive rhetoric of shithole nations, Mexican rapists, Muslim bans, the obsession with building a wall, all of this that we were inundated with. Um, the US is still stuck now in a moment in which there is need of immigration reform. The Biden administration has undone some of the Trump restrictions, but there's still confusion and chaos. What are some of the things you would advocate for for reform at this moment? What are some of the problems you see that need to be addressed?
Well, too many. We're just writers, and I think at the end of the day, I think we are sadly, regarding immigration, we're in a post-fact phase. Facts don't matter. I think immigration has become a very emotional topic, in which time after time, if politicians were to read a book and look at what immigrants bring into this country, reform would have passed years ago. Crime goes down, job creation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody wants to hear it. Everything is being led by emotions. And because of that, I think that we have to be reminded, that these people fleeing countries are human beings. And if it were up to me, I would, there wouldn't be borders. Everybody who's asking for refugee status should be granted one. But for a more concrete solution, I would, in El Salvador, our daily wage of the average job is $20 a day, and that's a really good job. Or no, $5 a day, $20 a week. And an application for a visa to the United States costs over $1,000. And it's the people that need it the most who can't afford to even apply for that thing. So one very concrete thing that I would change was just to lower those costs, just so people would go to the U.S. Embassy, the Canadian Embassy, etc., before they risk their lives.
Well, you mentioned life in El Salvador, and we know that, especially to our neighbors in the South, there are complicated problems in different countries. What U.S. policies, in a broader sense, what U.S. policies in Central America would be helpful to solving some of the issues that compel citizens to flee north?
There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of gender-based crimes that people are fleeing from. Their climate change is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for indigenous communities who can't grow crops anymore and have to flee. There's no access to water. These are the reasons why people are mostly fleeing. And I think I don't really envision U.S. policy, because U.S. policy has failed time and time again in Latin America. I think it needs to be a multi-country anti-corruption policy that maybe perhaps will keep democracy in Guatemala. Right now, I don't know if people are aware, in Guatemala, there are so many people running for president, and they're all facing corruption charges. And Nicaragua, that situation is what it is. In El Salvador, it is what it is. Democracy is at stake, and it's all because of corruption.
U.S. policies have often been on the wrong side, in many of our opinions, at least our views, during civil wars, Nicaragua, El Salvador. Do you think that U.S. policies could, and again, this is very general and broad, and I know you're not a policy expert or a foreign service worker, but let me put it this way. Have you gotten perspectives from friends and family back home in El Salvador about U.S. influence? I mean, are there ideas that come from the ground in El Salvador that you think could be useful? And
sadly, not people of my generation don't really know what happened in the 80s. We were all born in the 90s. In El Salvador, you couldn't study history until 2010. There was no history being taught at the universities. The war seems to be something that is contested, as if it never happened. And so because of that, there isn't much knowledge of how the US created that war, even in El Salvador, from some part of the population. There are other parts that clearly remember and blame the United States for creating this immigration problem and creating everything that occurred. And I don't know, there's now currently in 2023 in El Salvador, you can't really speak out for what's really happening. And, my family members don't really have opinions because there isn't freedom to have opinions as well.
Yeah, well, this gets back to the really fundamental issues that Writers for Democratic Action focuses on. That is the bedrock importance of free, open, democratic culture for the flourishing of a society. And, Salvador is not alone in facing repression and also the manipulation of intellectual freedom in the education system. This is a big issue, right? For our, it's starting to trickle into our own democracy, where we're seeing book banning happen and parents hijacking school curricula because of phobias about representations of reality. The suppression of reality is the enemy of democratic society, isn't it? Well, all right, that's one issue. Let me shift gears back to the literary for a second. A poet who shifts gears or even shifts lanes from one genre to another. You go from writing lyric poems to writing literary nonfiction memoir. What were some of the biggest challenges there?
It's like running a marathon. I was used to sprinting. This goes back to use a word, it would be privilege. When I was writing the poems, I didn't have the privilege to just spend an entire day writing. I was working multiple jobs. I didn't have enough money in my bank account. I didn't have a green card. And so poems for me were little capsules that I could feel good about completing in a short span of time because I literally didn't have the privilege of having more time in my day. And the biggest challenge was sitting in front of the computer and being faced with time before the pandemic. And there during the pandemic, it was even like, what I should be writing, I should be doing something. And prose to me felt like a mountain that I didn't know that I could climb, and I didn't know that I was capable of climbing. And you have to remind yourself every single day. And actually, reading the Murakami book about running, I forget the title of it, but there's a line in that book that he uses running, or like he gives himself an X amount of words a day. And whether he completes that or not, he knows that he can complete something because he runs every single day. And if he
Sure.
can complete a run, that makes him feel good about the next day sitting in front of the computer and finishing something, which I think is the same thing that happens in poetry, because you can complete a poem, you can call 4 lines a poem, and then you can feel good. And then that makes you go at it the next day. And so for prose, you have to learn the tricks that make you feel good and not feel bad about only writing 50 words in a day, or actually deleting 100 words that you wrote yesterday and restarting over, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. The sense of density is very different from the lyric poem in that way. And of course, you have to create plot, narrative, voices, character. Well, look, that's all for the specialized workshop. Let me ask you one more question before I turn it over to the audience. What have been the most surprising responses to Solito?
Hmm. You know, the title is the title for a reason. You know, I wasn't necessarily alone when my parents left. My grandparents were with me. I wasn't necessarily alone even during the 9 weeks because I meet Chino, Patricia, and Carla, who become like my pseudo family. How I really felt alone was carrying this trauma. I sincerely, wholeheartedly thought that there wasn't a, another kid who had gone through what I had gone through. And I haven't met one, I haven't met five, I have met tens of other children who also immigrated in 1999 through the Sonoran Desert. And five of those came around the same weeks or across the border. They were literally in the desert as I was crossing the desert as well. We were all there together. And what they told me was the same thing that I felt, is that they felt that nobody had gone through that. They felt alone. And what the book has made him feel is that they're not alone. And them telling me that also makes me feel that I'm not alone. So that has been the best responses.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I'm
Thanks,
going to
Peter.
go field questions here now. Um, let's see. Um, I'm trying to figure out here. Okay. Well, one question here is, what are you working on now?
Uh, Not much. um, I'm trying to write about what happens after. And I think it's going to be a book of short, it's going to be shorter, but it's going to try to address what it's like for a formerly unaccompanied child who is now undocumented and is growing up in at that time, the fourth richest county in the United States, which is Marin County. And how does he cope with inequality? And how does he cope with this newfound idea that there is such a thing as not having documents? Yeah.
Okay. I'm going back into a lot of the questions have comments.
Yeah, I'm reading
and
one about Russia. That's
yes. Well, it's one thing to say about the panic and crisis in Russia is that the Russia-Ukraine war has clearly, added to the refugee crisis in the world right now, the migration crisis, and 54 civil wars in the world at this moment.
it's about to be 55.
Yeah. Okay. Well, well, Russia-Ukraine war was on a separate list. Now maybe there's 55, but it does say something about the failure of diplomacy in the world. I'm going to go back into the question list here, and the question from Jackie Lydon is, could you tell us what stories you think others who've left might tell? Are there writing groups, for example, which encourage people to set down these narratives? Have you taught anyone else how to tell their story? Thank you, Jackie.
I get this question a lot. I haven't taught nonfiction. I haven't taught anybody else how to do it. What I will say, and this is not facetious, but it's literally about putting words on the page and making yourself write every single day, which is harder said than done. And what stories might be out there? I immigrated in 1999, and at that time, there weren't over 1 million Salvadorans in the United States. Now there are more than 2 million. We are the second biggest immigrant group in the United States. We just passed Puerto Ricans 3 years ago. The stories that are to come are going to be the Honduran book written by a Honduran, the Guatemalan book written by a Guatemalan. We're getting a lot of Venezuelan immigrants now. We're getting a lot of Cubans. These are all sadly similar stories, but different. I can't imagine leaving Venezuela and then crossing through Panama and then going through Central America, in which they also face discrimination, and then going through Mexico. There's a lot of coverage about how the United States is, their policies and how they're acting and building a wall, etc. Not enough coverage is given to how the Mexican government is also building similar walls in the U.S.-Mexico border, and how many people die within Mexico every year. Some of them are also Mexican, indigenous Mexicans. And so there's a lot of state racism within Mexico that it's also costing a lot of lives.
Right. Let me go back into the question pool. What are some of your favorite books and inspirations, and what helped you scale the prose mountain?
One of the earliest representations of a poet switching genres, and this is before I met Peter. Peter is one of them. But as an undergrad, I was in Poetry for the People, which is a program that was started by June Jordan. And June Jordan is a beautiful poet, but she also wrote this beautiful memoir about what it was like being the daughter of two Caribbean immigrants And I forget, I'm terrible with names, but if you haven't read that memoir, it was so honest and raw. And I was so surprised that she could get there to that point of, culturally, we're taught not to air our dirty laundry. And here she was, a queer Black woman with Caribbean roots doing exactly that. And I also have to owe my lineage to Edwidge Danticat, who writes about the Haitian diaspora and what immigration does in her prose and in her nonfiction and in her fiction. That boat scene in my book, I couldn't have written without the very first story in her very first book titled Crick Crack. And it's about two Haitian lovers. One is in Haiti, the other one's in a boat. And in fiction, they were like writing letters to each other, and one of them dies in the Caribbean. And that, after reading it, re-traumatized me in the best way possible if that could happen. That it reminded me of my own journey in a boat in a different ocean. But I had locked that inside so deep that I didn't remember being on that boat. And so reading books that are not necessarily about immigration through the Sonoran Desert has been, to use a word, easier to access than books that are directly addressing my trauma. And I think this is a common practice. So whatever trauma you're trying to write about, I suggest you look at other similar things that are not like hitting what's that expression? The nail in the head, or what is it? Is that the expression? Yeah, I got it. My wife makes fun of me because I don't get English expression to this day. But you're seeing how. Yeah, I know. I'll leave it at that. Those two books mean a lot to me.
Good to know. I was going to, well, let me go field another question. I have plenty, but let me go field another. Okay. This question from Janet Balakian, my sister-in-law. Your story is poignant and impactful for readers. There's a granularity in Solito missing in American Dirt. I felt like I was next to you experiencing your journey. In an interview, you stated that you wouldn't be able to make the journey today, and why? Can you explain? Cadeo for you?
It's a great question. Well, to answer the first one, there's a granularity, I think, in my story because it's a memoir. I lived it. I went through what I'm describing. And the next question, I wouldn't be able to make the journey today. I think it would be much more difficult. The thing that happened in immigration into the United States was that when I did it in 1999, and I want to say anyone who did it before 2001, 2002, was that there were individuals like coyotes who genuinely thought that they were helping people, which they were. They were fulfilling a hole in the market. There were people trying to get in, so then these people were helping those people. What the cartels figured out was that they could make money from people. And this happened around 2001, 2002. Since then, you cannot go through Mexico safely without paying the cartel's money. If you don't, you run the risk of getting killed, murdered, or and people that do that are how you hear going through the La Bestia, the train. And so that is what I mean by that. Immigration has turned into a whole different monster. It was already horrific when I did it, and now it's just gotten exponentially worse. And the Cadejo, to me, you know, I grew up Catholic. El Salvador is a very religious country to a fault. I don't. I am mostly native. I am Nahuatl Pipil, and I think the biggest atrocity that has occurred in my country and in a lot of Latin America is that colonization and religion have broken our links to our indigeneities and our roots and who we actually are. The Cadejo is one of these figures that has somehow survived the genocide of our indigeneity. And the Cadejo is literally a spirit dog like creature that each one of us has, and they protect us. And so I grew up with this tale. It's like a fairy tale for us. But it's also tied into our indigeneity. And I truly believe that it's my ancestors who protected me. It's not a Western idea of God, but it's the people, the Mayan, the Nahuatl Pipil people that I come from that helped me get here. And that's why it was very important for me to include this idea in this tale that is true, and to remind other Salvadorans that we are indigenous and that we should be proud of our indigenous roots, and that we should pray to our ancestors and to things like the Cadejo. Thank you. That's a great question.
Javier, while you're reflecting on indigenous roots and culture, I want to ask you how this memoir has affected your family. All over, family in the US, family in Salvador.
Um, I just described my own trauma, and I was very aware of not including my parents. When they appear, they're just shadows, because they also lived their own trauma. I am not a parent, but I can't imagine what it would be like to not know where your one and only child is for 7 weeks, and for you not to be able to do anything about it. You can't ask the Coast Guard to go look for, the submersible in the Pacific, in the Atlantic. They couldn't do that. They didn't have papers. They were undocumented. If they went looking for me in Mexico and I got to the United States, we would have been separated again. So because of that, my mom hasn't gone past the chapter 1. It's very difficult for her to even remember those weeks. For my dad, and my mom, I want to mention, my mom is in therapy. So I think she is aware of the weight of the words and what I mean. My dad read it. Now he's finally he's in group therapy now. But when he read it, he wasn't. So he was doing that very manly thing of oh, this is a work of art. It didn't really happen. And so I don't think he really felt it. I think he processed what I was describing, but he didn't feel it. But they both apologized to me, which I think as a son, I wanted them to do. My family back home, my grandpa reads the newspaper every day. He has a copy of the book in Spanish. He's very proud. I think he finally understands. I think it's hard for family members to understand what poets do, but I think prose writers, it's easier for them. They're like, oh, you write books, and he's just telling everybody in town that he's in a book, and he's just I don't know. He loves the attention, but he's also aware of the people that I described, and it was hard for him to finish it because he also wasn't with me for most of the trip.
Javier, before I ask you if you'll read, and I know friends in the audience would like to hear you read another passage before we close, is there any way for you to know at this point what the impact of your memoir has had in a broader sense on people or culture in El Salvador? Like, has there been enough time? Maybe there hasn't, but if there has, or what have you picked up if you have? What vibes have you gotten?
I think the worst, I don't know, I'll start. I was very afraid of putting this story out in the world because it's my trauma. And I did so much work with my therapist before publication day. And I think I'm finally aware and at peace with, a book. When you write it, it's like putting a kid in a subway, in a train. The doors close and you stay on the platform, and then the train goes to who knows where. You can't be there with the kid, with the book. I've been very fortunate that Solito, that kid, has gone to a lot of places. I am here talking to you months after the book came out. I'm about to take a plane to go have an event. I couldn't never imagine the reception that the book would have gotten. I am apparently the first Salvadoran to make the New York Times bestseller list, which is historic. And I don't think it's really sunk in. The book is now, it's already out in 3 languages, but it's gonna come out in at least 12. It's like, how do you process that? Why? It's the why do people care? I'm very surprised that people do care about this kid, because for 20 years, I was 100% certain that people didn't care about kids like me who had risked their lives in the desert to be in this country. And now I hope that sales turn into change hearts and eventually changing of policies, and that people can really see that immigrants are not only statistics or numbers, but they are people capable of feeling, of huge amounts of empathy, of love, and that hopefully that love and empathy is also returned to them.
Yeah, well, Javier, what you're noting here is powerful for all of us, because your memoir, your work as a writer, is an embodiment of why literature matters to the very foundations of societies everywhere.
Yeah.
That the stories, this particular story of this particular boy, has large meanings that reverberate in an age in particular when 1 in 74 citizens on the planet is in refugee crisis because of the extraordinary turmoil on this planet at this time. This is a profound, a profound reality that it is hard to take in.
Yeah, there are more. I think 2 years ago there were more. I think that number has increased. There were more refugees in the world than the U.S. population. I think there were 350 million refugees at one time, and now that figure has grown.
And I can imagine I do want you to pick another passage to read, but I will ask you this apropos. Wait a minute, I have more questions here, so I should stanch my questions. Hold on. Okay. Yeah. I think
there was one up ahead, I think, that we missed.
People want you to read, so we will do that. Did we miss anything?
No.
You talk about trauma and being triggered, and every day or every week, you, like other recent migrating refugees, have to encounter the news of horrific things happening all over the world. I mean, 240 people drown, in a migrant boat sinking just last week. That just has to be challenging for you. But I think, given the time left, unless you want to comment on that, I would love you to
No,
read.
that was one of the propellers of me. I never wanted to write nonfiction. I generally thought that I was going to write poetry and only poetry for the rest of my days. But it was precisely the coverage during, I think it started in 2016, even before Trump became president, of the crisis at the border. And I use this because it seemed to me that Americans were just beginning to realize that there were children who also were crossing the border. And as a child immigrant myself, knowing that we have been doing this for decades, it angered me. It angered me that the media was finally focusing their lens on us, and it overly focused it. And when that occurs, and I think that it did occur from 2016 up until 2018, when there was like a over focus on this one thing, and you see all these horrific images time and time again, that I think it numbed everybody. I think when you think of that period, I remember three very horrific things that I don't even want to describe, but they come up to my mind because they're there. And that re-traumatizes all of us survivors who have lived it. And is that re-traumatization at the same time that you have a very racist and xenophobic president at the top of the biggest empire in the world. So it was very difficult to really navigate the world during that time. And I didn't want to write this. And then also, there were other people who haven't survived what I've survived, who are making money writing about similar things that I live. So all of that turned into anger, and the anger luckily came out in a book. And I think now, if you haven't, and if you don't have the privilege of having a therapist and a support group that I do have, I think it's still very difficult. Now the news are returning to focus on the immigration crisis, which is going to continue to occur. But I think the lens have to change. I think focus must be given not only to the horrific images, but also to different aspects of immigration, which is what I attempted to do, was to humanize these people, not only flatten them to the worst minutes, the worst moments of their lives, which is when the cameras are training us in the United States and in the developed world to only look and care during these horrific moments.
And in one very basic sense, another reason why the success of your book matters so much, it tells a story. Your success is a story for the wider culture to note. But in the last 5 minutes, I want to turn it over to you to read a passage for us. And I know people are excited about your book, about reading it and getting it if they don't have it.
Thank you. And thank you, Peter. I'll read the end of chapter 1. And what you have to know is that Mali is my aunt, Lupe is my other aunt, and Julia is my 5-year-old, my baby, at that time, baby nephew, and the baby niece. And that's it. Okay. April 6, 1999. It's dawn. Indigo, like when mom left. Mali kisses me awake and I have to get ready. The roosters crow. La Bonita barks. The birds sing. The world is waking up. The stars turn off one by one. To shower, I pull water from a well with a bucket. Grandpa already showered. Abuelita drives me off. Mali irons my clothes. The outfit has been picked out. A nice dress shirt, dark blue jeans, a black belt, black dress shoes. Next to the hard-boiled eggs, avocado, queso duro, and tortillas, a black backpack. Even the brand name has been crossed out. Inside it, a dark t-shirt, black pants, 2 pairs of underwear, an extra pair of shoes, the plastic toothbrush, a comb, soccer shorts, Colgate toothpaste, a bar of Palmolive soap, Head and Shoulders shampoo, and another dark blue, short-sleeved dress shirt. There's a notebook, Bic pens, pencils, and the assignments my teachers gave me. Everything has to be dark colors, Mali explains. The coyotes order. I eat, and Grandpa waits by the door, holding my black backpack and his own regular one. He looks at his watch. Abuelita combs my hair. Mali kneels in front of me to button my shirt. She tucks it in, kisses my forehead. Lupe is here, the earliest I've seen her come visit. She hugs me, kisses me, wishes me luck. Julia is sleeping in Abuelita's bed between 2 pillows to keep her from falling. Abuelita kisses me, kneels to hug me. Then Mali and Abuelita hug me at the same time. Only now, I cry. This is it. The thing I wanted to happen, but it's happening so fast. Te queremos mucho, Chepito. Te cuidas. Que Dios te bendiga. Here, everywhere, always. We'll be waiting for you, praying you'll make it there safely, Javiercito. Their voices almost in unison, soft, breaking with every word, tears running down their round faces. I can't stop crying. Then they make the cross over my forehead, over my head, over my entire body, wiping my tears with their hands. Grandpa grabs my arm, walks me past the door. Don't look back, he says. But I do. I see Abuelita and Mali in the middle of the door, holding each other. Lupe has a hand on each of their shoulders. Come on, Grandpa says. And we walk.
Javier, there could be no more beautiful way of ending our conversation. There's nothing to say but take that in for all of us. Thank you. Thank you for your work, for the impact of this memoir. Keep going, and we'll keep talking.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your support, always. Thank you, Books and Books.
Thank you.
Bueno. Gracias a todos.